February 1943. The North Atlantic is a vast graveyard of steel and salt. Under a bruised sky, a Type VII U-boat lies silent beneath the waves, its diesel engines quiet, only the hum of electric motors breaking the stillness. Inside the narrow steel tube, red lamps flicker. Condensation drips from the bulkheads. 44 men wait, pressed by heat, silence, and dread. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Wolfarth grips the periscope handles, his knuckles pale against the oily metal. Through the narrow lens, endless water, but the horizon vibrates. Then it comes, a dull, distant buzz growing louder. Aircraft engines. Impossible, he thinks. They are more than 600 miles offshore. No plane should reach this far. The crew holds its breath. The sound swells above them like a storm. Then a sudden explosion above, the muffled thunder of depth charges rolling into the deep, crushing the pressure hull with each concussive wave. For months, the Atlantic had belonged to the hunters of the Kriegsmarine, but on this frozen morning the sea itself seems to change sides. The sky has joined the war beneath it. When war returned to Europe in September 1939, the Atlantic Ocean became more than a trade route. It became Britain's lifeline. Over 60% of all food, fuel, and raw materials sustaining the island nation came by sea. To German eyes, this floating artery was both a target and opportunity. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boats, saw the Atlantic as a chessboard on which small steel predators could starve an empire without setting foot on land. In those first months, Germany possessed only 57 operational submarines, a fraction of what Dönitz envisioned. Yet these few proved lethal. The British Royal Navy, stretched to guard coasts, colonies, and commerce, scrambled to relearn lessons of convoy protection left half forgotten after the Great War. The first week saw chaos, merchant ships scattered, sailing independently, falling one by one to torpedo and deck gun. By winter 1939, the ocean turned into an invisible battlefield of mathematics and nerves. Each U-boat left harbor from Kiel or Wilhelmshaven laden with torpedoes, diesel fuel, and hope. The men called them iron coffins even then. Once submerged, a U-boat existed in total isolation. No chatter, no light, no rescue if the hull cracked under pressure. Yet morale remained high because the result seemed decisive. In late September 1939, U-47 slipped into Scapa Flow and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak, killing more than 800 sailors. The feat electrified Germany and humiliated the Royal Navy. It was proof, Dönitz insisted, that submarines could cripple Britain's power more efficiently than any surface fleet. By mid-1940, that prediction looked prophetic. France collapsed. The Kriegsmarine suddenly gained access to Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, which halved the distance to Allied convoys. From these bases, wolfpacks fanned out into the open Atlantic, intercepting merchantmen along the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. The happy time, as U-boat crews later called it, had begun. Radio coordination and Enigma-encoded signals enabled multiple submarines to converge on convoys detected by lone scouts. Attacks came at night on the surface, where the U-boats' low silhouettes were nearly invisible. Torpedoes struck out of darkness, igniting fuel tankers and freighters in orange blossoms that illuminated the waves for miles. Captains like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became national celebrities, aces of the deep, paraded by propaganda to a euphoric public. For the sailors on the other side, it was terror without warning. Merchant crews watched the sky and horizon with growing paranoia, aware that every calm day could end in fire. The Royal Navy deployed new corvettes and destroyers, equipped with ASDIC and early sonar to hunt the unseen enemy. But detection ranges were limited and the Atlantic's vastness mocked technology. The simple mathematics favored the hunters. Dönitz's long game was straightforward: sink Britain's imports faster than they could be replaced. He estimated that destroying 700,000 tons of merchant shipping per month would strangle the island's economy and bring it to its knees. In 1940, the U-boats nearly achieved that tempo, yet even in victory, problems brewed beneath the surface. The number of operational submarines never matched Dönitz's grand plan, and maintenance crews struggled to keep boats seaworthy under relentless deployment schedules. Still, by 1941, the Third Reich's submariners ruled the Atlantic twilight. Churchill later admitted that the only thing that gave me a real nightmare was the U-boat peril. At home, Factories and shipyards raced to produce Liberty ships, radar sets, and escort craft, but the new designs were months from sea trials. In the meantime, neutral waters off the Americas became hiding zones, and Allied convoys had to navigate them alone. Everything would change after December 1941. America's entry into the war would transform the scale of battle, and the ocean itself would become the next frontier of the sky. The noise of propellers over empty black water begins to merge with the drone of distant aircraft engines. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the Atlantic convoys initially celebrated the arrival of what seemed an oceanic giant. Yet in the opening months of 1942, that optimism dissolved into shock. The U.S. Navy, geared for Pacific operations and battleships, was unprepared for the silent war in its own coastal waters. German submarines saw opportunity. In January 1942, Dönitz launched Unternehmen Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat, a lightning campaign against shipping along the American eastern seaboard. 5 Type IX U-boats crossed the Atlantic and surfaced at night within sight of American boardwalks, their silhouettes framed by the very lights of coastal cities. Tankers burned offshore while jazz still played in hotel lounges a few miles away. The Kriegsmarine called it the second happy time. For the U.S., it was humiliation, no blackouts, few convoys, minimal radar, and a shortage of escort ships. The pattern repeated the Royal Navy's early mistakes of 1939. Between January and June 1942, U-boats sank over 400 Allied vessels. Eastern Sea Frontier reports read like obituaries for an unguarded coastline. But the United States possessed something Dönitz underestimated: industrial speed and technological restlessness. Admiral Ernest King reorganized the Atlantic Command, integrating U.S. and British intelligence while establishing the first permanent anti-submarine escort groups. American engineers adapted coastal aircraft, Catalina flying boats, Avengers, and later B-24 Liberators, for long-range patrols. Henry Kaiser's shipyards poured out Liberty ships faster than U-boats could destroy them, tilting the mathematics of tonnage back toward survival. Meanwhile, Britain tightened intelligence integration through the secret work at Bletchley Park, where codebreakers strained to read Enigma messages in near real time. These decrypts, labeled Ultra, identified wolfpack assembly points long before convoys wandered into them. Success was measured not in headlines but in ships that reached port unnoticed. By mid-1942, Allied aircraft were ranging farther out to sea. Yet there remained a deadly blank spot, hundreds of miles wide, known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Neither land-based patrols from Newfoundland nor those from Britain could cover this central region. U-boats exploited it ruthlessly, waiting where air cover ended and convoys were most exhausted. Every freighter entering the gap felt the shift, the eerie calm of vanished protection. Then came the slow reversal. Escort carriers, small, hastily built hybrid ships, joined the convoys with their own squadrons of Wildcats and Avengers. They extended watch and strike power deep into the former no man's ocean. Night attacks that had favored the Germans now turned against them. The Allies' new radar and the blinding Lee light, mounted beneath patrol aircraft, revealed submerged conning towers in an instant. In those months, navigation tables, weather patterns, and radar reflections began to rule strategy more than luck. The Allies converted the Atlantic into a network, waves of sonar pings, coded bearings, and radio frequencies. Every merchantman became a node in a defensive web. German captains noticed first the change in atmosphere. The Atlantic, once silent, now hissed with unseen presence. Radio transmissions were shorter. Dönitz ordered them reduced to mere seconds. U-boat men joked grimly that even their coffee tins might be broadcasting positions. Losses mounted steadily. For each successful patrol, others vanished entirely. Crews spoke of aircraft appearing above the most remote coordinates, hundreds of miles from any known base. A new myth spread among submariners, that the Americans must have invented an all-seeing eye, something capable of tracing them from the clouds. In truth, it was technology married to intelligence and sheer industrial scale. By early 1943, the statistics exposed the turning tide. Allied shipbuilding finally exceeded losses. Convoy escorts grew in both number and sophistication, armed with hedgehog mortars and depth charge patterns that filled the sea with curtain fire. Radio direction finding pinpointed transmissions within minutes. The hunter's ocean was shrinking. What had begun as Donitz's campaign of strangulation was being strangled in return, choked by steel, code, and the hum of aircraft above gray waves. The ocean that once hid the Reich's submarines was becoming transparent, and somewhere below that rolling surface, a captain like Wolfarth, listening to engines passing overhead, understood for the first time that his theater of war no longer belonged to him. The scene now widens to examine the conflict through its many human and technical prisms, the stories that reveal how the impossible conquest of the Atlantic sky became possible. The submarine war was fought as much against the sea as against the Allies. A Type VII U-boat was barely 220 feet long and just 20 feet wide inside, a steel lung packed with torpedoes, machinery, and 45 men. Conditions bordered on medieval. The air carried diesel fumes, sweat, and the tang of battery acid. Fresh water was so scarce that officers shared a single washcloth. Bread molded within days. Each patrol could last 8 weeks, with no news, no sunlight, and the constant awareness that a single depth charge could erase them all. At the start, this claustrophobic trial fed a strange pride. The men saw themselves as an elite brotherhood, invisible knights of modern war. Between missions, they roared through French ports in new uniforms, cheered by crowds still drunk on victory. But by 1943, fatigue replaced glamour. Half the faces of a returning crew recognized at Lorient never reappeared for the next sailing. The attrition numbed emotion, the unspoken knowledge that survival relied on luck, not skill. When Allied aircraft began striking the mid-ocean, the last refuge of psychological comfort vanished. Even surfacing to charge batteries brought dread. Lookouts scanned the horizon not just for masts, but for tiny glints in the sky that betrayed distant patrols. The cruise world had shrunk to humming compressors, condensation drips, and the eerie mantra repeated in Donitz's communiqué: endurance. Comrades, endurance. For the Allies, endurance was measured in laboratories and hangars. Technology turned imagination into weapons. Radar, once bulky and short-ranged, grew nimble. The British ASV Mark III, air-to-surface vessel radar, could spot a submarine's conning tower 6 miles away even on moonless nights. The U.S. Navy imported, refined, and mass-produced these systems under its high-urgency electronics program. Then came the Lee Light, a blister-mounted searchlight slung beneath aircraft, synchronized with radar to flare on across the last second of approach. Pilots described scenes like nightmare theater, a dark sea, a single periscope wake, then instant daylight revealing a small gray shape twisting violently before the first depth charges splashed in. One blink later, darkness returned, but the U-boat often did not. Every advance spawned counters. German engineers introduced Metox radar detectors that hissed warning beeps when Allied transmissions drew near. For a short while, Metox saved lives, but by late 1942, Allied frequencies changed, rendering those devices deaf and false, sometimes guiding crews straight toward detection. It was an invisible chess match of wavelengths evolving week by week. The scale, though, was new. The Anglo-American alliance pooled scientists, factories, and logistical networks into what Churchill called a wizard war. What began as desperate improvisation became systematic production. Coastal Command in Britain and the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet in Washington shared radar plots, anti-submarine doctrine, and aircraft allocations almost in real time. The Atlantic started to look less like wilderness and more like an enormous gridded laboratory. Donitz's wolfpacks had once defined the art of undersea warfare. Groups of 5 to 20 U-boats coordinated by radio, surrounding a convoy and striking from multiple angles in darkness. Each commander maneuvered independently yet responded to coded signals from headquarters. The doctrine worked spectacularly when escorts were few. In 1941-1942, single packs like Hecht or Eisbär could sink a dozen vessels in one night. But the system contained its own weakness: communication. Every transmission meant risk, an electronic flare revealing position. Once Allied HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, spread aboard convoy escorts, radio became a liability. Operators aboard corvettes triangulated bearings within minutes, allowing escorts to charge toward the unseen enemy. The convoy system itself evolved into something approaching living intelligence. Instead of docile targets, convoys began using zigzag patterns, constant speed shifts, and layered defense screens. Escort groups under men such as Captain Johnny Walker perfected aggressive pursuit. When Aztec sonar lost contact, aircraft or hedgehog mortars took over. The result was a synchronized rhythm of attack. Sound in the water, eyes in the sky. Explosions bridging the two. U-boat captains still scored victories. Convoy ONS 154 off the Azores, for example, but they paid dearly. The earlier ratio of 1 U-boat lost for every 10 ships sunk skewed sharply the other way. By early 1943, radio messages to Donitz were filled with frustration. Convoys heavily escorted. Air observation constant. Send orders. Cannot close. For Allied sailors, these months forged a new confidence. The old helplessness waiting for torpedoes in darkness faded. Night after night, tracer rounds from escort corvettes arced into squalls, a visual vow that the shippers of fuel and grain were no longer easy prey. Underwater, German crews listened to those depth charge patterns hammering through steel, timing the gaps between detonations, praying for silence. On the surface, meanwhile, pilots and radar operators refined the next generation of methods to eliminate the last pockets of safety. The hunt was changing sides, but comprehension lagged behind on both. Each believed it could still win by endurance. Both were partly right, and both were already consumed by momentum. The next view widens again, away from tactics to the minds that directed them, the admirals, organizers, and weary strategists who bled over maps as surely as sailors did at sea. Karl Donitz, the architect of Germany's submarine arm, lived by a simple creed: quantity and coordination would crush Britain. He believed in the U-Bootwaffe not as a supplement to fleet warfare but as its replacement, a weapon of decisive blockade. From his command post near Paris, walls lined with naval charts, he tracked the ocean like a heartbeat. Colored pins marked patrol lines. Daily radio traffic pulsed through decode rooms. Each victory reaffirmed his faith that industrial Britain could be starved into submission. By 1942, he had replaced Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, yet this promotion came with bitter irony. Now responsible for the entire fleet, he could see the imbalance of resources. Hitler focused on rockets and tanks, starving the U-boat program of metal and manpower. Still, Donitz drove his commanders relentlessly, exhorting them to attack, attack, attack even as losses deepened. He saw no alternative strategy. Withdrawal meant admitting strategic defeat. When reports arrived of aircraft appearing hundreds of miles from shore, he argued that persistence would eventually exhaust Allied industry. His counterpart on the Allied side, Admiral Ernest King, confronted a mirror problem: overstretched fleets and skeptical peers. King's brusque reputation, the man who hates everyone equally, belied a crucial virtue: organization. He centralized American anti-submarine warfare under the newly created 10th Fleet, a headquarters without ships of its own, but with global authority over intelligence, routing, and air coverage. From Washington, maps blossomed with arcs indicating aircraft ranges and convoy schedules. The task was mathematical: reduce the unseen sea-mile by sea-mile until no gap remained. Between Donitz's obsession and King's calculations stretched a battle of attrition dictated by geometry. One envisioned willpower conquering material odds. The other believed data and production would crush stealth. History would favor the one who built factories instead of metaphors. By late 1942, Anglo-American cooperation matured into something beyond alliance. It became a distributed organism. In Liverpool, the Western Approaches Command plotted convoys using newly decrypted Enigma intelligence. In Iceland, weather stations updated transatlantic air patrol routes. In Newfoundland, escort groups rehearsed with Royal Canadian Navy corvettes. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet aggregated every contact report into a vast mosaic. This coordination found its rhythm through technology and doctrine. The Allies standardized aircraft patrol zones, balanced long-range and short-range coverage, and created killer groups centered on escort carriers. Instead of reacting to sinkings, they began hunting actively, deploying surface forces to intercept suspected concentrations of submarines. Fuel and logistics were decisive. The U.S. could supply 90-octane aviation fuel almost anywhere. German forward bases struggled with shortages and Allied bombing of French ports. Maintenance that once took days stretched into weeks. The enchanted aura of the Wolfpack faded as submarines spent more time evading than attacking. Equally revolutionary was the psychological cooperation. Royal Air Force Coastal Command, long treated as a stepchild to Bomber Command, finally gained recognition and resources. Joint briefings with American officers redefined operational objectives from defense to domination. For the first time since 1939, Allied commanders believed they could clear the Atlantic, not merely survive it. Warfare in the Atlantic lacked the visible front lines of Europe or the Pacific. It demanded faith that unseen actions affected national survival. For sailors, morale became as strategic as steel. Merchant seamen, civilians in more than name, endured freezing decks and constant peril. Their casualty rate rivaled that of frontline troops, yet recognition remained muted. Many never knew that cryptanalysts at Bletchley or radar operators in Newfoundland had indirectly saved them. Inside U-boats, faith curdled into fatalism. Newly trained crews replaced veterans too quickly to inherit experience. Rumors of convoy battles circulated through ports like ghost stories. One pack annihilated, another never heard from again. Letters to families were censored or lost, leaving questions that outlasted the war. Even Donitz in his personal log acknowledged the manly courage, of crews he could no longer protect. On the Allied side, fatigue took subtler forms. Coastal patrols spent 10-hour sorties scanning monotonous gray, their eyes dilated from continuous strain. Many never saw an enemy, only vast emptiness. When contact finally came, a periscope wake, a radar blip, the surge of adrenaline often led to overreaction. Bomb racks emptied on whales and floating debris. Yet every false alarm held value. It kept the pressure constant, convincing German crews that nowhere was safe. The changing moral gravity of the war was unmistakable. By 1943, the question was no longer who possessed courage, but whether courage still mattered against machines capable of patrolling horizons faster than men could imagine. Air patrols did not tire and industrial output did not fear. The sea, long humanity's limit, was being rewritten as data. The captains beneath the waves sensed it before strategists admitted it. Each time they surfaced to transmit a position report, they risked destruction. So messages grew shorter, then stopped more often altogether. Silence replaced wireless traffic, as if the Atlantic itself held its breath. That tension, the quiet before realization, set the stage for spring 1943, when events reached a mathematical and moral tipping point. The battle would not simply shift direction, it would invert completely. The next scene unfolds amid those crucial months of convoys ONS-5, SC-130, and the terrifying ledger of Black May, when technology, coordination, and human exhaustion collide in decisive clarity. April 1943. The North Atlantic convoys plowed through sleet and fog, long lines of merchant vessels escorted by tired destroyers and corvettes that seemed permanently dusted with salt. In the previous year, the Allies had finally balanced the loss column. Now came the moment to prove whether technology and resolve could crush an enemy that once owned the night. Convoy ONS-5 sailed from Liverpool on 21st April 1943. 42 merchant ships and their escorts bound for Halifax, 300 miles northeast of Newfoundland. Spring offered no peace. Gales turned the ocean into a field of white ruin. For Donitz, the convoy represented hope of redemption after mounting losses. He ordered 30 U-boats to intercept, forming the largest wolfpack yet assembled. Think. To the men aboard those submarines, success might restore faith in the war below the waves. For 5 days, the two forces groped toward each other through storms and static. One by one, radar sets aboard the convoy's escort destroyers began registering faint blips, contacts surfacing briefly between squalls. Each detection brought a flare, a sonar sweep, a timed depth charge attack. Undersea commanders reported constant air and ship observation, yet they persisted. On 30 April, the Wolfpack struck. Night set in like a lid. In darkness thick with snow, red-tinted bridge lights and blinding gun flashes burst across the heaving water. Torpedoes ripped through the freighter SS Bristol City. Moments later, another merchantman exploded, scattering burning oil across the waves. The escorts retaliated instantly. HMS Tay and HMS Snowflake hurled depth charge patterns by sound, not sight, their crews deafened and shaken as water slammed against hulls. At dawn, Allied radar operators discovered the advantage had shifted. The storm that had hindered visibility also forced U-boats to remain surfaced longer for oxygen and recharging. Every few minutes, another radar contact emerged. Destroyers surged to intercept. Catalina aircraft from Newfoundland, flying at their extreme range, dropped flares into the maelstrom. By 2nd May, 9 U-boats lay destroyed, some broken in half by pressure after damaged ballast tanks failed. 23 Allied ships were lost, but the numbers told a deeper story. The pack had been broken mid-attack, scattered by coordinated sea and sky. For Dönitz, ONS-5 was supposed to reassert dominance. Instead, it proved the ocean itself would no longer hide him. The reports came at midnight into his command bunker in Paris. Boats overdue, their signals terminated mid-word. He paced in front of the Atlantic chart, a field of red and black pins. Each black indicated a U-boat lost. By May, they began to cluster like bruises. He sent a message to all commanders. Temporary setback. Maintain effort. Yet the setback was neither temporary nor isolated. While ONS-5 battled gales in the west, convoy SC-130 in May 1943 followed almost the same track, escorted by Allied Support Group B-5 under Captain Frederick Walker. Walker's tactics epitomized the new doctrine: relentless pursuit, radar coordination with air patrols, and concentration on each weak signal. For 4 days, his ships executed a rhythmic warfare almost musical in its timing. Locate, triangulate, strike. 8 U-boats attacked. 5 were sunk. Not a single merchantman was lost. In statistics, these encounters seem mechanical. In reality, the transition felt like revelation. Allied sailors, once defensive, realized the ocean could now be ruled through range and radar. Pilots flying hundreds of miles over empty water experienced the eerie sensation of omniscience. They could summon destruction on coordinates unseen by the human eye. On the opposite side, U-boat crews spoke of aircraft appearing from nowhere. The myth of the all-seeing sky gained reality. By the end of May 1943, the Allies had sunk 41 U-boats, 1/4 of those operating in the Atlantic. The Germans called it Der Schwarze Mai, Black May. It was not just defeat. It was recognition that the logic of the war had reversed. The hunter force that once roamed freely now required protection itself, sheltering in coastal shallows and hoping for sunrise. In London, Churchill received the Daily Admiralty report and wrote one simple note: "The moment we have waited for since 1939 has arrived." Shipbuilding output now exceeded sinkings by more than 1 million tons per month. Convoys crossed with increasing regularity. Air coverage linked Iceland, Newfoundland, Greenland, and the Azores into an overlapping network of patrol arcs that erased the so-called air gap. For the men still submerged, these announcements meant little. What they felt was the ceaseless pounding, depth charges rolling from corvette rails, sonar pings that echoed through hull plates, and engines straining to keep below thermal layers that might conceal them. Many never saw the aircraft that delivered their end. The ocean merely buckled once, then closed. The air umbrella was complete in theory, but it would require proof in blood during the summer campaigns that followed, when Dönitz launched one final bid to re-establish dominance before conceding the Atlantic entirely. That desperate wave would test both engineering and endurance to their final limits. For Karl Dönitz, May 1943 opened with optimism and closed with silence. 30 newly built U-boats had departed from French bases to reclaim initiative in what his staff called Operation Trutz. Within 4 weeks, half were gone. Signals from Lorient and St. Nazaire buzzed with requests that no one could answer. Boats overdue, last position known north of the Azores, or believed lost with all hands. Each message read like a litany of erasure. The Allies had perfected an unbroken aerial lattice. From Newfoundland, the Royal Canadian Air Force extended its patrols using long-range Liberators equipped with ASV Mark III radar and the blinding Lee light. From Iceland and Northern Ireland, coastal command squadrons filled the northern gap. In the mid-Atlantic, small escort carriers, converted merchant hulls, launched Wildcats and Avengers that hovered above convoys day and night. Even the Azores, brought into Allied service through delicate Portuguese diplomacy, closed the last square on the map. The result was omnipresence. Submarine commanders who once trusted the Atlantic's immensity found the sky intruding at every coordinate. The first split-second warning often came as an electric shriek on the METOX detector, then the crash of ordnance. The belief that no aircraft can reach us here dissolved overnight. In one strike south of Greenland, Liberator V for Victory of 120 Squadron RAF spotted U-456 on the surface attempting to shadow convoy HX-237. Within seconds, the aircraft cut across its bow, dropping a string of depth charges that tore open ballast tanks. The submarine struggled downward, engines failing until seawater short-circuited internal batteries. All men were lost. 3 days later, another pilot found only an oil slick. The event itself was one among dozens that month, but to Donitz's staff reading the aggregate, it marked catastrophe. More chilling was the statistical consequence. 1/4 of operational U-boats destroyed in 30 days. With crews averaging 45 men, this meant nearly 2,400 sailors gone in a single turn of the calendar. No replacement training could sustain such tempo. Donitz convened a somber meeting on 24 May 1943 in Paris. Charts of sunk ships and known Allied patrol arcs covered the walls. Each red circle marked an area where U-boat life expectancy had fallen below 1 week. He ordered a suspension of offensive group operations in the North Atlantic, a pause he described as temporary reorganization. But in practice, it ended the strategic campaign. The shock reverberated through Germany's maritime heart. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, once scenes of triumphant departures, became quiet. Sailors walked the concrete pens in subdued lines, conscious that most of their predecessors would never return. Propaganda photographs ceased. Spare parts stocked up. Fuel allotments were cut. An officer remembered hearing in the distance French laborers cheering Allied aircraft overhead, and realizing he could no longer deny who ruled the sky. Meanwhile, inside Allied command centers, the mood balanced relief with calculation. Admirals Harold Stark and Max Horton emphasized restraint. Success must be consolidated, not celebrated. The new directive was simple. No ship would cross any ocean without continuous air escort. To achieve that, Liberator production accelerated, escort carriers multiplied, and coastal airfields expanded along the Atlantic rim from Brazil to Scotland. What had been improvised coverage became systematic architecture. Technological symbiosis reached its peak. Radar to locate, HFDF to triangulate, sonar to confirm, and air power to deliver the final blow. The war under the waves had been transformed into an orchestrated equation, each parameter measured, optimized, industrialized. The Allied convoys that summer felt the difference. Where once anxiety had been constant, now sailors spoke of intervals of calm. Sightings declined precipitously. Only the debris, fuel drums, lifebelts, wreckage hinted at unseen battles. For the sailors who had lived through the worst months, Black May became more than a date. It was deliverance. Ships arrived filled with food, fuel, and the faint promise that the siege had been lifted. Churchill told Parliament, "The Atlantic lifeline has been saved," a statement phrased in the past tense but paid for in continuing patrols. Donitz retreated into raw arithmetic. In his daily log, he scribbled the observation, "Enemy air cover omnipresent, our losses disproportionate." He diverted remaining submarines toward the South Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay, but even those routes lay beneath vigilant aircraft. The sea lanes he had once described as Germany's greatest weapon had turned into its coffin. The transformation of May 1943 was both material and metaphysical. The Atlantic, long symbol of infinite concealment, had become transparent. It was no longer the medium of surprise but exposure. For the Allied airmen flying their endless grid routes, it was proof that persistence could conquer distance itself. For the men trapped below, it was the realization that bravery could not defeat mathematics. When June arrived, Donitz issued his reluctant order. Large-scale U-boat operations in the North Atlantic were to cease. The long chase was over. Yet the war had not finished its cruel arithmetic. New technologies and desperate experiments awaited. Snorkels, acoustic torpedoes, faster submarine designs. But the decisive moment had already dissolved into the sky roar above the waves. From this ruin would rise a brief aftermath of innovation and despair, as both sides sought meaning in the wreckage of triumph and loss. June 1943 found the U-boat arm in retreat, both physical and psychological. The harbors of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, once vibrating with departure sirens, now echoed with maintenance hammers and silence. The pens were still fortresses solid, their concrete roofs defying Allied bombs, but the morale inside had crumbled long before the walls would. Crews returning from patrols looked older, eyes rimmed with red from months of submerged tension. Word passed quickly through the ranks that Donitz had called back his boats. He described the pause as a tactical realignment, but the men understood. The North Atlantic, their proving ground, was lost. In July, he relocated operational focus southward toward the Bay of Biscay and West Africa, hoping distance might stretch Allied reach. Yet patrols were doomed almost from departure. The bay had become a gauntlet of radar and aircraft. Squadrons from British and U.S. coastal bases orbited continuously, radar screens glowing like constellations. Submarines were spotted within hours of leaving their pens. The passage once known as the Gateway to the Atlantic simply vanished. By autumn 1943, more than 240 U-boats lay at the bottom of the ocean. The attrition had become systemic, not episodic. Donitz demanded technical salvation. Engineers worked feverishly on innovations. The schnorkel breathing mask to allow diesel engines under shallow submergence. Improved torpedoes with acoustic seekers. The revolutionary Type WW2 electro boot, capable of unprecedented underwater speed. On blueprints, these measures promised recovery. In the field, they arrived too late. Factories suffered from Allied bombing, materials from shortages, crews from fatigue. At sea, the Allies tightened the noose with calm procedure. The U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet, operating out of Washington without a single commissioned ship, coordinated intelligence from every theater. Each U-boat sighting generated intercept vectors combining direction finding, radar, and even intercepted weather transmissions. Convoys ceased to be clusters of vulnerable ships. They became floating detection arrays. Each merchant vessel was equipped with radar reflectors and radio beacons feeding position data to escort commanders. Air patrols now treated the ocean as a living map. Liberators out of Newfoundland swept the cold northern routes. Catalinas launched from Bermuda patrolled the mid-Atlantic. Carrier-borne Avengers filled the gaps. In total, fewer than 20% of U-boat sorties in late 1943 achieved any offensive success. Each month they sank fewer ships, each month they died in greater numbers. Still, Donitz persisted. His tone to Hitler remained defiant, invoking the spiritual dimension of struggle. The Führer rewarded loyalty with rhetoric but little steel. The submariners who once basked in propaganda glory now slipped out of ports under cover of night. No fanfare, no photographs. Families stopped assembling on quaysides, too familiar with disappointment. New training classes of 19-year-olds prepared for missions whose survival odds were roughly 1 in 3. Among Allied commanders, victory brought paradoxical unease. The ocean was safer, but its ghosts lingered in every channel. Merchant sailors spoke of fields of floating oil where seagulls and wreckage drifted together. Coastal fishermen hauled up tangled steel, human remains still in fragmented uniforms. Newspapers printed success statistics, not these images. Churchill and Roosevelt understood the delicacy. Triumph over an enemy who had fought to annihilation invited sober gratitude, not celebration. They were brave men too, Churchill said privately after a briefing on sunk submarines, the rare admission of respect across the abyss. By early 1944, the tactical realignment had become permanent. The Kriegsmarine renamed many of its Atlantic posts or abandoned them outright. Germany's attention pivoted eastward toward impending invasion. Yet Donitz, ever hopeful of technological renewal, placed faith in the next generation of boats being tested in Baltic trials. The silent, fast, nearly all-electric Type VII. In theory, they might reverse 10 months of defeat. In reality, they existed mostly on paper and propaganda reels. The Battle of the Atlantic, as a continuous decisive contest, had already ended. What remained was reaction, attempts to adapt, to salvage prestige, to rebuild myths around endurance. The next and final movement of the story follows that aftermath from half-hope to extinguished illusion. As the war's tide reached its culminating storm of 1945, by the dawn of 1944, Allied air patrols wrapped the Atlantic in a blanket of observation so complete that for U-boat captains, surfacing was almost synonymous with death. Where a submarine once broke through calm seas to breathe under starlight, it now risked discovery by radar within minutes. The air belongs to them, one German petty officer wrote in his patrol log before being lost south of Ireland. It was the blunt truth. an unarguable summation of how warfare had evolved beyond human endurance. Long-range patrol routes stretched from the American East Coast to the west coast of Africa. Airfields at the Azores and Ascension Island closed the southern gaps. The Royal Air Force and U.S. Navy together flew more than 1,000 coastal surveillance sorties per week. No cargo convoy, no straggler, no rescue ship ventured unguarded. The U-boats that ventured out of the Bay of Biscay often met their end before clearing the continental shelf. Germany continued to launch new boats, but these were desperate gestures against algebraic odds. In 1944 alone, 117 submarines were lost, roughly one for every 6 sent out. The crews were younger and less trained. Many left harbor believing survival itself was victory. Inside Germany, the war economy devoured what remained of industry. Steel once destined for submarines went instead to anti-aircraft guns. Factories received messages ordering priority to defense of Reich territory, not to the sea. Lifeline that no longer existed, the supposed miracle. Designs, the snorkel-equipped Type VII C-41 and the elusive Type VII Electroboot arrived in trickles. Technically impressive, they waited at docks for fuel that never came or crews that no longer trusted the mission. Allied bombers pounded the pens at Brest and Lorient day after day, burying half-finished hulls beneath thousands of tons of concrete rubble. In one bitterly symbolic raid in August 1944, newly completed U-boats were destroyed in their pens before ever reaching open sea. That same month, the Allies liberated France's Atlantic coast. The remaining flotillas fled to Norway and the Baltic. The Atlantic War ended not with a battle but with a contraction, a continent shrinking away from the ocean it had once sought to command. Dönitz watched from his headquarters at Korala near Berlin, now largely cut off from reality, still drafting orders for deployments that could no longer occur. "Hold fast," he signaled, even as harbor commanders scuttled vessels rather than let them fall into Allied hands. For many surviving submariners, the war's final year was lived in a haunted stillness. They trained, repaired, and hoped without conviction. Mines and aircraft attacks destroyed many while still at harbor. Those who did reach the North Sea found British and American destroyer screens waiting. No wolfpacks, no coordinated tactics, just isolated boats hunted by overwhelming numbers. The kill ratio reached absurd levels. By early 1945, Allied analysts estimated an average of 6 aircraft sorties and 8 depth charge patterns per every single torpedo fired by Germany. The ocean had become automation's arena, conducted by machines more than men. When surrender came in May 1945, the Kriegsmarine radio codeword was simple: Dönitz Ordre, U-Boote kapitulieren. Allied forces instructed the remaining vessels to surface, mark themselves with black flags, and proceed to Allied ports. The sight shocked even veterans. Lines of submarines limping in formation, decks crowded with gaunt men blinking in daylight. One British observer wrote, "It was as if the sea were finally giving up its dead." Of more than 860 U-boats built during the war, over 750 were lost or scuttled. Nearly 28,000 German submariners, 3 out of every 4, never returned. At sea, the Allied convoys continued to flow, ship after ship unstoppable. The U-boat threat had once been considered capable of starving Britain. Now it merely salted the tide with memory. A handful of captured submarines were studied in American and British shipyards, their streamlined hulls hinting at future nuclear and diesel-electric designs. Paradoxically, from Germany's defeat in the Atlantic would emerge the core of post-war submarine technology. But between the past and the future stood an ocean filled with ghosts. Oil slicks, wrecks, and unnamed graves stretched across the coordinates once called the killing grounds. Pilots flying home after the last patrols reported seeing occasional buoys drifting below, markers without meaning, reminders that history had shifted from man to machine. The final years had reduced an empire's faith in invincibility to the thin echo of aircraft engines rolling over endless water. Yet from those echoes, the modern world's sense of technological mastery and its cautions would be born. The waves quiet now, the war's smoke fading into mist, and history turns its gaze from battle to remembrance. When the sea finally grew still, it revealed what war had written across its surface. Not victory, not defeat, but transformation. Between 1939 and 1945, The Atlantic changed from a wilderness governed by storms and chance into a meticulously mapped, patrolled machine. The German submarine arm, born from secrecy and daring, met its end through mathematics, cooperation, and endurance. The U-boat war had begun as a contest of courage, one captain against a convoy, one torpedo against a fleet. It ended as a demonstration of technological momentum, radar beams, triangulated frequencies, and coded intelligence woven into a seamless network. The ocean became knowable. In that knowledge lay salvation for some and extinction for others. For the thousands who died beneath the waves, the Battle of the Atlantic was never abstract. It was the smell of oil and battery fumes, the weight of silence after a depth charge, the brief light of a signal flare swallowed by cold air. Their courage remains unarguable, even as history records that courage alone could not conquer industrial awakening. For the Allies, mastery of the skies above the Atlantic proved something larger than strategy. It marked humanity's irreversible step toward total surveillance of its environment. Every mile once considered unreachable could now be watched, measured, and controlled. In this new order of war, distance ceased to be refuge. Donitz's captains had once believed the Atlantic was infinite. By 1943, they understood infinity had edges, drawn not by geography but by radar range. The lesson endured long after their defeat, that domination is temporary, and that every tool of vision carries within it a reflection of those who are seen. Today, the ocean rolls quietly above their graves, indifferent yet full of memory. Aircraft no longer scour its surface, but satellites trace the same flight paths their descendants once pioneered. The battle that decided the world's lifeline gave birth to a modern condition, one where no horizon remains entirely empty and no silence fully secure. And so ends the war beneath the waves. In a universe now crowded with watchful eyes, covering, as those astonished U-boat captains once whispered, every mile of the Atlantic,